Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you for joining us for Promethean Action Strategic Overview and Discussion. I'll be joined by Michael Stager, and many of you might have saw the email announcing tonight's discussion that Michael put out, which I think is absolutely important as he makes the statement that MAGA becomes the most important movement in 500 years. And you can see this from the standpoint of today, among many activities by President Donald Trump, one of them being the meeting he had with the South Korean president and meeting in the Oval Office. These were the remarks of the South Korean president, Lee Jae-myung, today. He started off by thanking the president for inviting him to the Oval Office and commended President Trump for the work that he's done in transforming the Oval Office and redecorating it. And he said it looks very bright and beautiful. It has the dignity of America, and it symbolizes the new future and prosperity of America. And he says, I believe that making America great again is your goal. And I believe that that is what is currently taking place in America. Very profound statements coming from the South Korean president. President Trump also talked about a lot of the deals and what is happening between the United States and South Korea, especially the development, as we reported on, of shipbuilding in the United States, building the ship industry once again in the most powerful way that since World War II, which President Trump emphasized a lot. But just this question of where the future of America, the world sees that under President Trump, as President Trump is bringing forth this true golden renaissance that he has committed to. And as we enter into the 250th anniversary of our nation in 2026, this has to be the goal and understanding of all Americans in what the MAGA movement must continue to fight for as we really drive toward the success of President Trump's agenda. And so what we're going to talk about is who is out to stop that drive toward greatness, making America great again, building toward this new golden renaissance. And today, if people missed the presentation that Barbara Boyd gave, I encourage you to go back and watch that for her Monday strategic overview on Promethean Action. And again, we do appreciate all the support. The numbers are growing dramatically in the supportership for those of you who are signing up to subscribe to Promethean Action and Promethean PAC as we drive 2026 and midterm elections. But what Barbara emphasized today is what's happened with those who want to continue to push population reduction, global population reduction, who don't want to see the birth rates of America or society as a whole grow, who want to keep pushing this green fascist agenda. These are the things that President Trump is taking on and is obliterating. And by what he is doing, by ensuring that the future of America and the world is bright, by ending these wars, by stopping the green agenda, getting rid of things like solar and wind and the insanity of pushing unproductive policies of energy back toward true productivity. So I want to turn it over to Michael because I want him to, again, discuss what it's going to take and what the MAGA movement has to understand about the true importance of what President Trump has built up. So with that, I would encourage you again, if you haven't seen today's update from Barbara Boyd, go back later and look at that. And otherwise, we will turn it over to Michael for his opening comments and remarks. And while he's on, I may break back in a little bit later on. We're crossing our fingers for a successful launch of the 10th flight of Starship or SpaceX Starship, as President Trump's agenda is Moon, Mars, and developing toward making America first in space exploration once again. So stay tuned for that. But let me turn it over to Michael for his opening remarks.
Great. Thanks, Keisha. And welcome, everyone. Those of you joining us maybe for the first time, seen our videos on YouTube. We appreciate you getting on tonight. The idea of these discussions, as many of you may know, is to kind of broaden out the kind of, in a philosophical way, in a historical way, a lot of the content you're getting in our assessments on YouTube, on X, in terms of the political intelligence. And the basis of that is because there really has been an attempt to control the culture and to control the way we think and discuss the world in front of us. So there's clearly a lot of current events that are shaping. And as Keisha pointed to, Barbara Boyd's assessment today on the Jackson Hole Central Bankers Summit is outstanding. It's insightful. It gives a clear perspective that what's been happening with this central banking operation. And we can give you kind of the books and some of the references to read, certainly by historian Robert Ingram, on the kind of the development of a central banking system. This thing emerges in the late 19th century as a system. It was initially established back in the 1600s as a way of running these colonial empires. But it became a global kind of imposition as nation states started to emerge in the late 19th century based on the American model of economic development, a national model of development. And to subvert that, they deployed these kind of globalists in London, in Paris, in Brussels, and Amsterdam, deployed effectively this central banking system. So the gathering today has really been a long-term conspiracy. Many of you have probably read the Jekyll Island book. You know the conspiracy, and the kind of what went into kind of tricking and deceiving the American people and Congress into adopting this central banking system of the Federal Reserve. But part of what I want to discuss tonight is not just that dark conspiracy, but how mankind, and especially within our civilization, because there's a uniqueness in the fight of our civilization. And this is why you have to broaden it from the immediate political developments. We've got to create a richer historical and philosophical discussion of what I would describe as the Judeo-Christian worldview, a worldview that has been in battle. It's not simply a worldview that incorporates Satan into it. I mean, clearly Satan is a picture, and that is part of that perspective, but it's been at odds over the course of 3,000 really longer years, but with 3,000 recorded and probably many, many eons beyond that in terms of unrecorded history of a fight of two fundamental opposing worldviews. And the one we've adopted today, the one we know of today, is that Judeo-Christian worldview. The other one could be described as a kind of oligarchical worldview, a worldview that a few will rule the masses, the kind of unwashed masses concept. And that has been at conflict. And understanding that debate is perhaps the most important thing any of us can understand to then comprehend all the other events and developments that are happening. But I would say even more importantly, the initiatives we have to take to win this battle, at least win it to the point that the next generations are in a better position to wage this war, are more cognizant, more developed, more prepared, and have a greater arsenal to really continue mankind and our civilization winning. Now, in the email, so that's kind of why we try to take a broader discussion on Monday nights to situate you, and then allow for discussion in that context. Because I find personally, if you broaden out the discussion, you also then get a different level of questions, of thoughts, of insights from just the general audience. And for Keisha and myself and Tony and others who participate in these, Barbara and Susan on the videos, you guys are the membership. Whether you participate on the Thursday live discussions on YouTube, you get on Monday nights or Saturday nights on the Zoom calls, there's a chance to participate in live discussion, to hear your thoughts, hear your ideas. But we're building an army, a kind of wide awake army like Lincoln had, in the 1860s. Keisha mentioned the 250th birthday of the United States. And it's worth kind of reflecting on that. That would be the very midpoint of a 500-year period. And if you go back 500 years, what you see is that we're somewhat at the tail end of the core process that was unleashed as the golden age of Europe. Starts to some degree in Florence and in that northern Italian area. It was probably to the greatest degree intellectually shaped by the great Dante, the poet. But there were a number of factors. We're not going to go into those tonight. That's certainly for a Saturday class at some point. And if Bob Ingram is listening, he may maybe want to consider that. But by around the early to mid 1500s, there's already a fundamental attack on the golden age of Europe. It continues to develop. You get the Shakespeare age in 1600 in England. So a kind of renaissance or a golden age of England flourishing. It's in this environment that you get the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the Cambridge Plato School and this intellectual eruption in England around religion, but not just religion, but what the religious or Christian worldview or Judeo-Christian worldview or Abrahamic worldview that was developing at that time was then recognized what was the necessary course of action to wage war on the evil and satanic nature of a dominant oligarchical structure growing in Europe, because they were waging war. They were waging war on the Golden Age. They were waging war on the developments of modern science. And there are too few people today, including far too few scientists, who fail to recognize that during this Golden Age, when the concept of modern science develops, it's intimately connected to the hypothesis on the nature of God, on the nature of the Creator, that these things are fundamentally intertwined. There is no separation of religion and science. But and there's so much more that could be said there, but I just wanted to touch what's 500 years as a reference point. It's the last time we had a golden age. And what's the pinnacle? What was the pinnacle creation? Some might say the Mona Lisa. Some might say Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Some might say the Dome of Florence. But there can be no doubt, at least from a certain, elevated perspective, that the greatest artist, as we had a class on Saturday night by Will Wirtz on Friedrich Schiller, who said the greatest form of art is true political freedom. And it's from that elevated perspective, there can be no doubt that the greatest pinnacle achievement of that golden age was the creation of the United States. That it was the great minds and geniuses inspired by this eruption of creative industry in Europe coming out of the Black Plagues of the mid 14th century, and the banking collapses and the oligarchical corruption and the various internecine warfares that had gone on. And there was a kind of an eruption of a creative impulse, of industry, of statecraft, of new technologies, the Da Vinci quality, of artistic hypothesis, of architecture, of industry. And it's certainly a question of modern science and the nation state. People like Joan of Arc, who was basically the leading founder of the nation state in France, operated off of a kind of grassroots concept of Christianity that was just profound. And it was kind of operating underneath the kind of the oligarchical and feudal structures, was this emerging quality of value and strength in the qualities of leadership that people like Joan of Arc and many others took at that time. The crowning achievement of that process, like we said with the Pilgrims or the Puritans and then various waves of Mennonites from Germany and the Rhine region, and Quakers, and steel making, iron production, and the forges, that the economic and cultural developments that came into the early colonies and then eventually philosophically formed in collaboration with great minds in Europe, the idea of establishing a new kind of nation state on the principles of our civilization. The ancient ones and the new ones that were introduced in the course of this new golden age. But oftentimes you see that there's continuity between the ancient ones and the new ones. It's kind of a higher hypothesis, unfolding different layers of the principles that have been the foundation for our civilization to advance. That is embodied into our Constitution and into the political and economic and cultural factors that are the United States, that create its formation. So when we say this movement is the most important in 500 years, it's to echo and reference that we are somewhat the bearers of this tradition. It is kind of our birthright as Americans to recognize we carry, based on what our nation has become, the responsibility to bring these principles of our civilization forward. But they can't simply be conserved, as often is referenced with conservative culture. We're not simply hoping to conserve them. We have to advance the principles. You have to take what's been given and improve them. And that means improving the minds of your citizens, improving the productive powers of labor, that people become more productive through new technologies, better infrastructure, better education, better qualities of collaboration. You're building a stronger, more prosperous nation, and you're also then adding to the deeper philosophical elements in new and advanced ways. This is really the course of human civilization. Now, how do we know this? How do we measure? Like, okay, this maybe 100% of you listening totally agree with me. That's a gamble, but let's just say it's the case. It wouldn't simply make it true, even if there was unanimous agreement. How do we measure that this outlook is true? Well, if you go to the email, and I guess I'll share it. If you go to the email that was sent out tonight, you'll see a mapping. Let me just find it real quick. Oh, maybe I'm not going to find it right now. Here it is.
Did you find it, Michael?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, thanks. Sorry. All right. So, so if you see this chart, it shows a steady population growth from 5 million years ago, slowly developing up until around 1400 AD. And all of a sudden, something emerged. It was a down point. This, of course, is the chart points to the Black Death that lasted it was a 10-year period, some estimates, but it was longer, 50 or so years throughout different parts of Europe, devastated, wiped out 50% of the populations of some regions. Some entire towns were completely lost in the process. It followed a total banking collapse that was kind of running the Venetian banking empire at the time. But look at what happens to human population. And anyone looking at this has to say, and you have to take it far enough back to really see the magnitude. But anyone looking at this goes, what changed there? What happened? And of course, there's a delayed propagation. So it's not, even though it maybe really starts to peak, some charts pointed at peaking, starting to really go hyperbolic in 1900. I'll stop the sharing. I think people get the idea. Some people say it starts really growing at around 1900. But there's a delayed propagation. You have to see the overall broader extension of the process to realize that the event that took place was approximately 500-600 years ago. And it lasted for maybe a century of really advanced development and contributions that were just profound. I mean, if you haven't read the story of Joan of Arc, I mean, most people think it's almost imaginary and made up. If we were to say that, how do we account for that level of scientific empirical effect? That the population on the planet went from less than 1 billion, 500 million, but not just the number, but the slow rate of growth, the linear rate of growth that was occurring, then transforms into something of hyperbolic growth. You say that's a kind of singularity, a kind of moment that suggests something entirely different about the process we're engaged in. Because most people assume that life is this kind of linear, gradual, slow process. But that suggests something of a completely different power was unleashed. And when you look at the nature of that singular moment, you find that it took the ancient principles that the Greeks and Egyptians, and to some degree the Romans, but certainly the ancient Greek culture, what we recognize around Plato and Socrates as kind of the standout figures. Something fundamentally changed in the 1400s, where these ideas are now reincorporated, but not simply they're reincorporated as a formula. There's something happening that is already kind of burgeoning around a certain concept of human identity, the nature of God and the nature of man. And again, there's a lot that could be said, but there's an empirical, clear effect of that process. And what it causes us to consider, if you take at least my summation of the causes and the nature of the effect, that there's a dynamic unfolding of that gives us a better sense of what we are as a human species, what the human race is, what it means to be made in the image of the Creator, and how we act in that regard. And the effect that if we understand that, make that conscious, make that cognizant, not simply as something for the afterlife, but that has relevance in the material world, right? There's a lot of Western philosophy is somewhat based on a separation of ideas and material, a false division entirely. And any Christian ontology, I think, refutes that pretty clearly. But there's an obsession with it. But it's very obvious that this idea of the nature of man, the nature of creation, the nature of the Creator, can have a direct and massive hyperbolic impact on the material world. And so that creates a whole different kind of consideration. The role of the United States in this kind of 500-year period, is instrumental. It was in the late 19th century when the United States economic powers began to peak, where that the principles we had based our country on, contrary to the cheap slave labor system of the Confederacy and much of the world at that time, that we had developed a different concept and then we had to work to implement it and create the industrialization and manufacturing and scientific foundations. We then unleashed that dynamic globally. That population capability, the ability to support this rapid rate of population, came from industry, infrastructure, new science, new technologies, and broad-based applications to the population as a whole, not to a small oligarchical and ruling feudal class, which was the basis of empires and of societies for everything prior to really the creation of the United States, maybe minus just a few exceptions that prove the rule. So what is the central bankers? How do they respond? Well, today, or over the course of last week and the weekend, they make a declaration that it's time we've got a problem. The problem isn't just the tariffs. And Powell says this in a speech, even though there are tariffs and they may increase in prices a little bit, you really can't call that inflation because it's not a boiling pot. It's like you threw a hot stone into the water, it will get hotter a little bit, but then eventually it'll go back to room temperature. You're not putting a flame on it. You're not printing money like, hey, we usually do in the central banks. So he makes a concession and even, has to kind of genuflect to Trump's insistence on lowering the rates probably in September. We'll see, but probably. But he talks about then this demographic and labor question and immigration and labor supply. And that you get the sense that this is the actual underlying obsession, that far more problematic for the central bankers than just the tariffs have been shutting down the border, reasserting national sovereignty. And that in essence, tariffs are just an expression of that reassertion of national sovereignty. That the central bankers really are at the center of a globalist system. And if you've been on these previous Mondays and we've talked about the Bretton Woods system and a new Bretton Woods or a new global economic system, go back to John Maynard Keynes's proposal, the British leading figure at the post-war system, developing the person that was involved from the British Empire to develop the post-war system. He wanted an entire system, not based on the dollar, not based on the United States, not based on the nation state. He wanted a system entirely based just on central banks. And that central banks would be in coordination to govern all trade, all currency, that you would have a global system that would basically be an imitation today of how the European Union and European Central Bank govern now all of Europe. That would be the essential system globally, had the British had their way after World War II. So the central bankers are the leading managers or instruments by which these globalists operate to control currency, to control pricing, wages, inflation, and even foster and facilitate wars. It was that same kind of banking that collapsed prior to the Black Plague in Italy. And that clearly that if this system had continued unabated without our intervention, without President Trump's intervention in 2016, under Hillary Clinton, that same kind of collapse could have happened because there is no regard for universal principles. There is no regard or conception of the creator from this oligarchical and globalist class. So we get into a certain sense of what would have happened had Trump not won, how catastrophic that could have been. And this gets at the point of the population collapse ongoing today, that the population fertility rate in the world is already beginning to drop. And within the course of this century, it will likely go negative, meaning that you'll actually begin to see a collapsing population on the planet as a whole. At this point, South Asia, Africa still largely have growing populations. Most of the developed world has fertility rates under replacement. And increasingly, you can see that taking place on a global scale. They are taking the economic and the success of our civilization over these 500 years, and they are looking to undermine it. And one very easy way to undermine that is to destroy national sovereignty and to destroy to replace the population, to basically take the population that has a sense of the principles of that civilization handed down from father to son and mother to daughter over generations, and part of a national culture handed down from one great leader to the next generation consecutively, from Washington to John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams to Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln to McKinley, McKinley to Roosevelt, Roosevelt to Kennedy, Kennedy to Reagan, Reagan to Trump. This kind of dynamic of political leaders, some far more, significant than others, but that there was some kind of passing down that then gave the population as a whole regardless of what your family background was, but access to this sense of the course of history that our nation was participating in. So Trump has intervened to break this dynamic up. But it's not simply Trump and the policy set. It is a deeper cultural question. Um, you know, it doesn't seem like it coincides, but we also see that there's a homogenous global culture that you could go from one town to the next in the United States, and you would almost feel like you're in kind of the Truman Show, as if everything's been staged. It's the same store, the same logo, and the same plaza next to the other same stores. The regional accents, the regional dialects, the regional industries, the regional foods. I mean, maybe there's still some of that. It's not completely eviscerated. But you see that happening within the United States, that the regional cultures, the regional industries have been somewhat taken out. Everything's kind of just bland consumerism. And it's not just the United States. You can see this kind of phenomena taking place even on a global scale. That globalization as a structure and as a system managed by the central banks has a much deeper cultural factor to it. And that cultural factor is oftentimes what you want to continue. It's what you want to replicate. It's what you're excited about handing to your children and grandchildren. It's the great ideas that your parents and grandparents handed to you that you see as so important within civilization. But if civilization itself and the society you live in doesn't reflect the great principles of religion, of philosophy, of scientific thought, if your scientists have become simply bureaucrats pushing, political dogma, it doesn't give you great excitement to want to continue that. If your churches start to peddle false doctrines or the fear and intimidation of a bacterial infection rather than the immortality of the human soul, it doesn't give you great inspiration to want to continue that dynamic. And I'm just trying to give some anecdotes of what this cultural factor, how it manifests, and how it's been attempting to reduce, and I use that word specifically, kind of a reductionary approach, that human life is simply just about survival, pleasure, excitement, consuming the things and having the experiences that one wants. That they've cultivated that sense that that's what human culture and human identity are. Simply a pursuit of pleasure and experience, rather than that great sense of sacrifice, of responsibility, and this that we are as individuals, each of us, responsible for the civilizational development that is responsible for the explosion of human population on the planet. And that each individual of that exploded human population has the quality of power of mind that reflects the image of the Creator, that there is perhaps, and I would assert, there is nothing more powerful in the universe than that human mind that reflects the image and power of the Creator. That our civilization was able to generate that kind of phenomena, politically, culturally, economically, and that the creation of that phenomena is our country. And that what we are seeing today is a revival within our country. This MAGA movement is a revival now, 250 years after our birth, to the reality that for nearly over 100 years, really 125 years approximately, they have these central bank globalists, oligarchical, kind of European oligarchical structure has been looking to decimate our country specifically, but the kind of cultural outlook, that Judeo-Christian worldview that we came to represent, not as simply a religious view, but as a scientific, political, economic kind of concept. A culture based on those principles, and not just based on them, based on the ability to foster advancements in the understanding of those principles. This is what President Trump, whether he would agree with me or not, doesn't matter to me. I think he would. But this is what he has revived in the United States. And our founder, Lyndon LaRouche, intended that some individual like President Trump would emerge to herald this kind of political change. Mr. LaRouche spent much of his time making sure that someone did, and to the best extent that he could help that effort. So this, to me, is the deeper meaning of what the MAGA movement is becoming. And for the central bankers to come out and to explicitly kind of orient around this kind of population control and population reduction or population replacement is just such a clear indication of the kind of fight we're waging. And to me, I know I spent some time on a college campus yesterday talking and organizing to the students there in downtown Detroit. And it's not hard, I think, for probably many of us to have an experience often right now where you look at the population and you look at our culture and you basically think, or you listen to the news and you think, there is no way we're going to save this country. You just see what's happened. You've seen what's taken place. You see the shape and the condition of our citizens, and you just think there's just no way this can happen. But I think what we all have to remember is that it's a question of leadership. When Joan of Arc emerged as a 16, 17, and 18-year-old girl to lead the army of France and to establish France as the first nation state, France had been battered and bruised in wars for something like 50 or 60 years by the English. They weren't in good shape. The population wasn't in good shape. But it's what lies not on the surface of your population, but what lies in the hearts and minds of your population. And to what extent can you pull out? What lies in there is that image of the Creator. It's there to be acted upon, but it has to be called forth and it has to be given leadership. President Trump has certainly done that. All of you are doing that by participating in these kinds of calls and discussions. People that are running for office are participating in that. And the more we can do this in a self-conscious way to act upon that underlying phenomena, that underlying principle that there are potential explosions of human phenomena that are entirely based on the adoption and reassertion of these quality of principles. That's what happened 500 years ago. And I have no doubt in my mind that the United States today will once again be the leadership in reviving those principles again, demonstrating what national development looks like and offering that quality of national development to every nation on the planet. And to the extent we can consummate that commitment, that intention, then we will set the foundations to kind of eliminate the scourge of central banking and globalists as any kind of major political power on the planet. Because once nation states are fortified through real industry, through real science, through a real understanding of the Creator and creation and our role in it, then we've fundamentally changed and I think have manifest what is our nation's destiny. So that's what I wanted to present. Hopefully you found it compelling and provocative. Keisha, I'll maybe invite you to jump back in. Tony Pappert's joining us again tonight. If he wants to say anything, he should jump in, and we invite you to raise your hand and ask any questions and give your thoughts.
Thank you. Okay, so I will invite others to join in the discussion. I just have to say that this is the level of discussion we need right now in terms of just how profound we're seeing the transformation of our society and the needed transformation of our society taking place. And this, I just wanted to say that recently in the context of which you were just presenting, Michael, on this question of the Judeo-Christian principles and science, the idea of Christianity and science, there not being a dichotomy between the two, and really this concept of the true nature of man of human beings in the image of the Creator. And I was watching this video that came out a couple of months ago with 3 astronauts, one of them recent being Butch Wilmore, who was on the flight with Suni Williams that got stuck on the International Space Station for a long time, who was very Christian, religious man, and he was praising and giving honor and thanks to God, Creator, during his mission. And a lot of people took offense to that in some ways. Also, they had someone who I had the opportunity to have a platform with on stage, Charlie Duke, who actually flew and was one of the 16th astronaut, one of the last astronauts to go to the moon and to walk on the moon. And a lot of them were talking about how their relationship with God and the understanding that there is no dichotomy between science and biblical principle. And it was just profound to listen to because they were taking on in such a profound way, in such a truthful way, this culture that will push ideas such as a flat earth. And they were showing these beautiful pictures of the Apollo 8 mission when the astronauts of Apollo 8 were flying around the moon and would see the Earth rise and are saying, you look at these pictures and you see how the Earth is not flat. There's nothing flat about the Earth, but the beauty of this and the participation in creativity and God's creation and how anybody could promote such foolishness in terms of flat earth society or say that there's some sort of dichotomy or distance between God and science and what it truly means is not truly understanding what the creator and what creativity they are participating in. We are participating in as human beings. I thought it was just such a profound discussion to see these astronauts up there, not saying, well, we can't be astronauts and going into the moon and going into space and believing in religion or God. But they said that that's not true. You become closer to God and closer to religion in this context. And I thought it was so beautifully stated. And that's what, I was thinking about as you were talking, because there has to be a transformation in our culture and our society to truly understand what we're participating in creativity, in creation, in what the beauty that God has intended for us in our society. And that is what Trump, in the political sense and all senses, really trying to bring about. And with this concept of a golden renaissance, what that truly means. I mean, President Trump is not God, he's not perfect, he won't start. But the question is that what are we truly as a society trying to bring about?
Yeah. I mean,
It's
that's
quite
what they've tried to keep from
important.
us the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I want to do is invite others to join in the discussion.